Hi, I'm Susan Weisbauer, co-author of The Well-Trained Mind.
And I'm Susanna Jarrett, editor at the Well-Trained Mind Press. And we're talking about education for all parents and for all children in all sorts of settings. On this episode, we have two guests, Nathan Otto and Shelby Otto. Nathan and Shelby are two siblings who are both homeschooled and are now off in the world doing amazing things. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Hi, I'm Nathan. Pleasure to be here. I will be starting a PhD program for earth science in the fall. I've always loved studying life and rocks, but I've only recently started to try to figure out how the two go together. So it's very excited to be doing that.
And Nate, where'd you do your undergrad?
I did my undergrad at Virginia Tech, majored in biochemistry. At the time, I was actually really interested in just infectious diseases. And since then, read some really interesting books and have basically done a 180, which just goes to show it's never too late to figure out what you want to do.
I don't know. Is infectious disease to earth science a 180? That's an interesting philosophical question.
I would say maybe a 90 or a 45.
There you go.
It is definitely an obtuse angle. For sure.
Okay, there you go. I like that. And you and Shelby are how far apart in age? Always thinking about it.
You're 3 years older than me.
Okay.
Okay, I liked the thoughtful look there where Nate's like,
Don't ask me that.
Don't ask me that question. Hey, listen, I don't know how old my kids are. I always have to stop and think about it. So, Shel, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Shelby. I'm currently an undergrad at Virginia Tech. I'll be graduating spring 2026. I'm pursuing a major in wildlife conservation. And before that, I got my associates in science at community college. And then before that, I was homeschooled.
And you have kind of a interesting program you'll be pursuing this year, right?
Yes, I will be going to Antarctica at the end of this year. It's part of my study abroad research requirement for my major.
Okay, and wait, I have to just say I am very good friends with Shelby's aunt, whose whole goal in her entire adult life is to go to Antarctica. So how are you and your aunt getting along about this?
Oh, we've become the best of friends ever since that announcement has happened. I think she's planning to sneak into my suitcase, to be honest.
Become be your scribe, right?
Right.
It's exciting. Well, when you're in Antarctica, if you could do me a favor and look around and see if there are any pumpkins being grown in any research stations that you go to. We had a smart globe growing up, and you could click on any continent or country and it would give you a fact. And one of the ones that my siblings and I never forgot was you would click on Antarctica and it would say, Antarctica is the only continent on which pumpkins cannot grow. And so my siblings and I always said, well, one of us is going to have to go to Antarctica and grow a pumpkin someday. So
I'll have to bring some pumpkin seeds.
I know. Surely you could grow a pumpkin in Antarctica.
I know, right?
I feel like this is the thing. I mean, they grow tomatoes in Iceland.
Right.
In space.
It could have been an outdated smart globe. So that's kind of on my mind. Maybe you'll see a pumpkin. Let us know.
I'll definitely keep my eyes peeled.
Well, thanks for joining us. We want to talk a little bit about your homeschool experience and kind of how you got to this place of both of you pursuing different things, very different things, but both in the sciences, which is particularly exciting for us because here on the Well-Trained Mind podcast, we are a little bit biased towards the humanities. And I think in general, homeschooling may be a little bit biased that direction. And so we would love to dig into your experiences as homeschoolers and how your parents created an environment where you both ended up pursuing something that is a little bit non-traditional for homeschoolers, which is the sciences.
Yeah, let's start with Nate, because Nate, again, I know both of your parents, and I know they are wonderful people, but neither one of them is a scientist. And I do think with a lot of homeschooling families, you tend to steer your kids towards what you feel more comfortable with. So how did you end up in the scientists?
Sure. It's important to state I was always that very curious kid that wanted to go outside and look at the lizards and or the rocks. So that you need that to start with. But the big thing that they did to enable that was they enabled my curiosity in terms of if I wanted to go to the library, they took me to the library. If I wanted to go to the science museum, they took me to the science museum. They were always very encouraging of my interests. And while they would, talk about getting a practical job and making sure that I knew the importance of that. They were not the type of people who'd be like, you're going to do XYZ, be a doctor or a lawyer because you'll make a good living. So they balanced the practicality with the interests. And so I've always felt like it was something that I could do and should do.
And how about you, Shelby? Did you have a similar experience?
I would say that I did, yes. I've always been interested in animals, so me pursuing wildlife conservation kind of felt natural. But growing up, I was always encouraged to go to the library. I was encouraged to watch documentaries and learn. I was basically a sponge. I would read books and memorize them and repeat the facts until they annoyed my whole family. But yeah, so I was very much encouraged to learn. And if my parents didn't know something, they'd show me how to learn about that. So it was, if they didn't know about something, they knew how to learn about it. So yeah, I would say they encourage that.
And if I may, to add on, even if they were not scientifically trained, they were educationally trained. Odd phrasing, but they knew how to teach and how to. So we learned to read very early. We were encouraged to read and to read for content and to be able to analyze and tell them what the chapter was about. So I feel like I very early on was given the tools to really dig into some of the denser topics.
Yeah, our mom is an English and grammar teacher, so she knows a lot about, even if it's more not necessarily the sciences part, but still learning how to read and learn from a book. She taught us how to do that. So even if we're not necessarily doing it for learning about like the character's motivations, we still know how to analyze writing well.
And then I feel like also it's possible that you guys, I'm thinking back on you guys are a little younger than my kids. But I feel like you possibly benefited from the fact that you did have access to online courses in a way that my kids didn't. So it was maybe a little easier for your parents to direct you towards, areas that they didn't have expertise in. Nate, would that be accurate?
Sure. Like you said, people are more comfortable teaching what they're more familiar with. And I think something that my parents did very well is they recognized, once we got into high school, okay, I am not able to comfortably teach, say, math and science. Mm-hmm. So let's find an online course and pair them up with an instructor that can do that, who's trained to do that. Still in a homeschool setting and still very much having a say in what classes we're enrolled in. But you have to be able to recognize where your strengths are, and they did that.
Yeah. And Shell, did you do online classes as well?
Yes, I started them, I believe, right at the start of high school, and I went to the same online school that Nate did. It was Well Trained Mind, and I think that worked out really well because I was still in the homeschool environment, still had, my parents helping me, but it gave me a little bit more freedom to do classes with someone teaching me who was an expert in the subject and knew more than my parents would know.
Right.
What years were you both homeschooled? Was it all the way through or high school or?
It was all the way throughout various points of the, let's say, elementary and middle school period. We would join co-ops. Mm-hmm. But for me, actually, it was from the 10th grade to the end was at the Well Trained Mind. Shelby, I believe it was something similar for you.
Yeah, I think I must have started a grade or two earlier than you at the Well Trained Mind because we started at the same time, just at different ages.
So for high school, you had online programs where you could dive deep into your particular interests. But being in the sciences, you were both interested in the sciences from a young age. Did you feel like there were resources there for you as far as like, did you have like a favorite science curriculum that you used? Or did you feel like there was enough there for you to dig into in like elementary, middle school? Or do you have any memories of that?
I will say that is something I struggled with as far as the lab experience, because having access to, say, a high school lab is very useful. I made do with lab kits, but it was something you had to put in a lot more effort towards. Mm-hmm. And again, my parents were able to make that very deliberate decision of realizing, okay, my kids are very interested in this. We're going to go the extra mile. Mm-hmm. So that is something you have to be very deliberate about.
Yeah, let me just put in here, and then I want to hear Shelby's thoughts on this as well. We have recommended a lot of lab kits in the Well Trained Mind because often that's the best thing that is out there, but
Mhm.
I've never really been happy with that recommendation, particularly for families that aren't very science oriented. It's kind of like saying, I don't know, it's kind of like saying to somebody who doesn't know how to bake, here are all the ingredients, make the cake. And I've never felt like that was a really satisfactory solution. And Nate, was that your experience?
Yes, lab kits. There are definitely some that are better than others. It also depends highly on the subject matter. I got a geology lab kit recently because I went back to community college just to keep teaching myself as I'm trying to switch careers. And that one was great because it was, here's 15 rocks with letters on them, try to identify them. When you get into biology or chemistry, that's when things get more complicated. And I will say some of the lab kits were disappointing. They might have changed, and it might just be brand dependent, but it is something to be aware of.
I'd agree with that. Like, because with the chemistry lab kits, obviously they don't want to send you anything too dangerous, right? And there are limitations to what they can send through the mail. So that really limits the kind of experiments you can do. And in terms of like the biology lab kits as well, it's my memory growing up, it was very limited. Again, that might have changed. But when I went to community college and was doing an in-person lab for the first time, I remember being really excited about that.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I know Susanna has lots of questions, so don't let me just dominate things and get things off track. But I'm really, since this has come up now a couple of times, I wonder if each one of you could talk about your experience at community college, because I feel like a lot of parents are sort of reluctant to think of community college as a really good option. And yet, although you've both got different educational paths, you both seem to have really benefited from your community college experience. So I wonder if, Shelby, if you could start talking about your experience, and then Nate, maybe you could fill in with your own.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So my community college experience was slightly atypical because it did happen right at the same time COVID happened.
Oh,
so
right.
it kind of became a hybrid online and person. But the parts of community college that weren't affected by the COVID experience, I really enjoyed. I think it's definitely worth doing community college to get, those like basic courses through. And, they had the labs where you're actually doing the things in person and you have the teachers. So overall, I just felt like it worked out really well for me. I think it's a good option, and it can help you figure out what you want to do and what classes you enjoy before you, do all that extra financial and research burden of like finding a four-year college.
Right. And you were still living at home, I think, Shelby.
Yeah,
when you went
so
to
that
community
helps
college.
as well with like the transition period. You're not completely moving out and dealing with doing in-person classes for the first time. It helps with that transition.
Right. And Nate?
Sure. This is actually a soapbox of mine because I had that similar thought of viewing community college as a subpar experience. And to be fair, there are some downsides compared to a classic four-year school, but not to try to brag on myself too much, but I did start at community college and I am now starting a PhD program at Johns Hopkins. So if you treat it like a regular school, it will give back everything that you put into it and it will set you up. The other thing to bear in mind is that at a four-year school, there are some professors who teach because they like teaching, and others they are contractually obligated to, and they're mainly there for the research. No one teaches at a community college unless they enjoy teaching for the most part. So some of the best teachers I ever had were at one. So no regrets. Financially, college is far too expensive these days. And unless you have at least somewhat an idea of what you want to do not go to a four-year school if you don't have at least an inkling. Use community college as an opportunity to figure that out, to take a variety of classes, and you won't be in debt.
That is such good advice. And it's good to hear from someone who's done this recently, right? Because most of my experience is a little on the slightly better aged side now. So it's good to hear that. All right, Susanna, now that I've thoroughly derailed us, what else do we want to talk to Nate Shelby about?
I don't think so. I don't think that has to be a big derailment. We'll kind of bounce around the questions a little bit, but I think it's a good segue into talking about how homeschooling prepared you all for what came next. And if you felt coming out of homeschooling, particularly because you were moving into the sciences at the time that you were graduating, did you feel prepared? Were there things that you wished you had done differently to be more prepared?
These are such good questions.
Do you mind if I start?
Yes,
Go for
please
it.
take it away.
So as with anything, there's pros and cons, and I'll start with the pros. Academically, I felt very prepared. I knew how to study, and I knew how to study independently. Obviously, it helped that for the most part, I was taking classes that I was already interested in, and I liked the subject matter, but I knew how to make a study schedule for myself. I knew that I shouldn't be waiting on the teacher to be telling me do this, do that. So that helped me hit the ground running. But again, that was a very deliberate choice on the part of my parents, so I can't speak for everyone with that. I did struggle. Obviously, it is a big jump going from living at home to living at a university, even with community colleges is sort of in between.
Mm-hmm.
And I did struggle a bit with the that sort of big fish in a small pond to big fish in the ocean jump. And so there are some downsides, I would say. If you're homeschooling your kids, make sure you find opportunities for them to interact with other kids.
Mm-hmm.
Co-ops are great. They need more than that. If you're not used to being in a school environment, it can be kind of socially awkward, and I definitely felt that. I think there are strategies people can do to help with that, but that will always be there at least a little bit. So be prepared for that.
We've actually, and Shelby, I want you to address this too. This is something that has come up, I think, in every episode we've done so far with homeschool grads and parents of homeschool grads, is that adjustment period to the new social group is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I do just wonder, this isn't really a question for you, this is just my reflection. Maybe it's difficult for everyone, just in various ways. I mean, I don't know. I have the experience of going from being homeschooled into college and totally feeling like I had no idea what anybody was talking about and why they were acting the way they did or any of those things. But I don't know, Suzanne, I feel like now we need to have a public school grad and a homeschool grad on together and have them compare experiences, because I just wonder how much of that is sort of common to the experience of going into college.
That's an interesting point, because, it is a defining point in so many people's lives who choose to go to college. And, being that freshman on the first day, I mean, a lot of people talk about that, whether they're homeschooled or not. And we talk about, as homeschoolers, like, well, what about socialization? Does that set you back socially? I never felt like I couldn't overcome it. It was just a big transition. I don't know, Nathan or Shelby, if you had a different perspective, but it was like, this is different. This is strange. This is going to be an adjustment, but I feel like I got there and it was okay. But
yeah, Shelby, I know that since you went from homeschool into community college and then into the 4-year, where did you feel like the biggest pain point? Can we call it a pain point? What was the biggest pain point?
Probably the transition from the community college to the 4-year, because then I wasn't living with my parents and, it was starting basically completely from scratch because I didn't have parents or siblings or childhood friends or the community college friends. So it was once again kind of starting from scratch in a new area. And so that was the biggest pain point in terms of like the social aspect of it, especially since, again, I did have the community college to help me with, but because all of COVID made it be hybrid, online and in person, I don't think I got as much practice with the community college in terms of the in-person social environment as I could have gotten.
Are there any things that, looking back, you wish you had done while you were still homeschooling that you think would have made it easier or not?
I think being part of more social groups would have helped. It was hard because we did live in a pretty rural area. So in addition to being homeschooled, everywhere was a long drive. So being a part of a lot of different social groups was just difficult, especially since we were too young to drive, for most of that. So it was just based on how well our parents would be able to drive us, worked around their work schedules. And then it was hard for each of us to have our own social thing because it was hard for parents to be driving, multiple kids around kind of to long distances.
Yeah. And that's interesting, and maybe something that our listeners could think about, which is that there is actually a correlation between homeschooling and people in rural areas. And then there's a correlation between people in rural areas and people who didn't get enough social interaction because their parents didn't want to drive them 40 miles every night to a thing. So I think the correlation is not necessarily directly between homeschooling and we didn't get enough social interaction, but a lot of it is just sort of geographical? Anyway, I just put that out there.
I see your point. I will say I think there's probably some overlap on the Venn diagram, but they can definitely be compounding factors. So if you are homeschooling your kids in a rural area and you have kids in different age groups, be prepared to be driving them to a lot of different places and be kind of full on soccer parent, because it does become a full-time job. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Interesting. All right, all you farm parents, you heard it here first. I was one too, so.
We'll be back after this.
Here at Well-Trained Mind Press, we are excited to announce our newest title, Writing with Ease Level 2 Revised Edition. This book includes 36 weeks of writing instruction and activities for enthusiastic and reluctant young writers alike. You'll find scripted lessons for the teacher to read, as well as interactive consumable pages for students to enjoy, which means that you can offer your student an excellent year-long writing program without worrying about prep work. The revised edition also includes a bonus creative writing lesson at the end of each week. Check out samples on our website, welltrainedmind.com, and use the code PODCAST at checkout for 15% off your purchase. Happy writing!
Aside from that aspect of like transitioning into the social life at college, were there anything that you looked back on post homeschooling and felt like you missed out on from the traditional school experience? You've mentioned labs. Anything else that you were like, man, I wish I got to do that?
I don't know about wish. I mean, I guess this kind of ties into the social part, but doing any kind of like group projects, that's a new thing for doing in college. Is doing a lot of group projects. I mean, I had a little bit of experience with it with the online school, but when you're a kid, you're doing group projects with your siblings. You already know what you're good at. So in college, it's a new skill to learn. Like, am I good in a leadership position, or am I more of a follower? You kind of have to figure that out in terms of group projects, like figure out kind of where you fit into a group and what skills you have in regards to group projects.
I would like to add on to that because I think one of the things that socializing with students does for you is you don't just learn how to hang out with people, you learn, in a sense, how to work with people. So it's one thing if you take your kids to play with the other kids down the street. I mean, that's great. You should do that. But if I didn't have community college as a sort of buffer and a figuring out zone, I think I would have really struggled with, be it group project dynamics, forming study groups. There's a lot of context that is specific to schools that you will not get as much of if you're just homeschooling. Again, I'm not saying don't do it because of that. Be aware of it. It will make some things harder. Everything has pros and cons.
I think this would be actually a useful thing to point out to our listeners, particularly those who are humanities people, is that being in the humanities is much more conducive to solo research and going and doing your own thing than being in the sciences. So there is much more of a need to know how to work in groups and to do collaborative work and collaborative research in the sciences than there is in the humanities. I will tell you from personal experience, you can get all the way through a history PhD and never have to work with anybody on anything ever. But that's not necessarily going to be the case if you're doing upper level work in the sciences. So if you've got a science oriented kid, it seems to me like it's particularly important, and even if you're in a rural area, to find places where they can work with groups on joint research projects and start to understand how that works. And I mean, I would think that the internet would give you opportunities to do this in ways that maybe didn't exist 10 years ago. But it is definitely, I think you guys, Shelby and Nate, would agree, it's something you got to put some time and thought into.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. I will, because I hadn't actually thought about the differences between the two different work styles. Yes. So in science, your best tool is your ability to communicate. It does not matter if you get good results if you cannot defend them and share them. And I mean, for doing a PhD, it culminates in a dissertation defense. You are putting together, this is what I did, and you're defending it. And people that you have known and that have supported you throughout your process will be looking for any weak point, not because they're trying to be mean, but because they're trying to make sure that you have something that passes muster.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, if you have a kid that is interested in going into the sciences, find them things to do where they can work with other people, and not just in let's make a baking soda and vinegar volcano. Find them a research project they can do. Find them a debate class. That would be the most helpful. I benefited from that in my co-op. And if you're learning how to do that for the first time while also learning how classroom dynamics worked, I think that could be tricky. So I'm very glad I got that experience out of the way in high school.
Yeah, Shelby, you want to jump in on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And as well, just knowing how to divide up work between each other, making sure that because when you're a homeschool student, you might be used to, completing it all yourself. But when you're working with a group, you don't want to be taking on the whole project yourself, because you need to learn how to work with other people and use their strengths and their weaknesses. And yeah, I never did the debate class, but I did get to do a public speaking class at the community college, but I never did a debate class. And I think I probably would have benefited from that.
There's a real, I feel like I'm just, thinking back on my own experiences with in college. And again, I'm speaking from a humanities point of view. Everybody always hated group projects because group projects always felt like an excuse for everybody else to slack off while the one person who actually wanted to get a good grade did the work.
Yep.
So I think, particularly if you're not a science person, and I'm speaking here to parents, I would think that recognizing the value of group work and what it's actually for is super important here. And I would say that in most cases, in undergraduate classes, group work is not well thought out by the professors who are assigning it.
I can confirm this.
Yeah.
I have not had, at least up until maybe, you're in your senior year and you have a capstone project and the stakes are actually there. If you are going in and you're a freshman, sophomore, even a junior, and you just have a general course and you have a group project, just brace yourself. Because like you said, it's usually used as a way of busy work, unfortunately. I think that's a shame. I think it can be such a great opportunity to teach people how to work together. So if you get a chance to practice that beforehand and to start to learn how to set your own boundaries, maybe this time you have to do 110%, but don't do 200% because that's not fair.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with where it's like the group projects for the classes most directly tied to my major are the ones that I'm really enjoying. Some of perhaps the earlier ones were not quite as enjoyable.
That's very fair. I remember dreading them in college too, but not until you both were talking about it I haven't thought about this in a while, but my sister and I did National History Day together, my senior year, her junior year. And I'm thinking about it as you all are talking, because I think you can kind of create that even with siblings. Like that project was something we were both passionate about. She didn't care about history. I love the history. She was doing the video editing. We made a documentary. She did a documentary and she did all the technical aspects, and we worked so hard together. And to this day, it bonded us. Like we're still best friends, and it started there. And obviously that's not always going to happen when you do a group project, but we learned a lot, and that was with a sibling. So I think in homeschool, you can create some of that practice even within your own household if you have multiple students. And then there may be benefits of, doing online classes that include group work and things like that too.
There is some benefit to learning how to do that with new people that you just met.
Yeah.
So I would say try to do both. I think a lot of parents would be interested. I'm not a parent, so I can't speak for them. But I imagine if one approached me and I was a parent and they were like, hey, we want to set up a neighborhood project for X, Y, Z, or a debate club. I would be thrilled. Yeah. So I would look into that.
Well, that's so interesting because I've always been a big proponent of sort of using your community resources. I'm always saying to people, ask around at church and find out if there's somebody who speaks Japanese and is just dying to teach Japanese to your kid. So it's an interesting thought that one of the things you could ask around about would be to find somebody with some scientific expertise and say, hey, we want to do a group project. And the purpose of this group project is to teach the kids how to work in a group responsibly and effectively and what they can do for the group and what the group group can do for them. So I'm feeling a new project coming on here, like writing about how this can be done. So Nate, I'll be contacting you about helping me to outline this. That's great. I like that idea a lot.
Okay, so coming back to some of our questions on the outline, you both are currently navigating studies in college and beyond. And so did you feel like going into college being homeschooled, there were misconceptions about homeschooled students that sort of have haunted you, or do you feel pretty accepted in a bigger space?
So from like my friends at college and from the people that I've interacted with, I haven't really dealt with any of that. Like I don't feel like I've been treated any differently for being a homeschool student or anything like that. It's more from people who like I haven't really interacted with, where when I tell them that I was homeschooled, they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I'm like, "No, don't be sorry." I'm glad that I was. But yeah, so I feel like sometimes people assume that I didn't like being homeschooled when I did. So I always tell them that I liked it because I did.
That's very presumptuous to respond to somebody else's experience of growing up with, "Oh, I'm sorry."
I'd say I had similar experiences sometimes. Normally, it would either just start a conversation. People would be curious. I think the issue is, there are some people who don't homeschool their kids well. There are some people who just don't have business being teachers. I don't think that's most parents, but there are some who don't, and those stories get out. And when you're talking about someone's education being ruined, that is a big deal. And so I see why that magnifies. It is also important to recognize I don't think that's the majority of cases. And so it's an unfortunate misconception. I would say most of the time didn't cause many issues. Don't have much more to say on that.
I ask because I wonder if it is changing or will just continue to change, because I feel like things are different now. And maybe it's because I work for a homeschool company, but when I say I work for a homeschool company, I get so much interest and joy. Whereas I remember growing up and being a little embarrassed to say I was homeschooled, but I don't feel that anymore. So I feel like it's changing, but maybe there's still some room. When I was in college, one time I told a guy I was homeschooling, he said something like, "Oh, I would never have thought of you that way." Like,
oh no. Oh dear.
Like, what? So that's why I asked that question. Are there any other misconceptions about homeschoolers that you just dread hearing? Or
I would say so. You've got those the two stereotypes. The one is the parents who are unlearning their children, or whatever the catchy term is these days. On the other hand, you've got the homeschoolers are weird stereotype. And I am at the age where I embrace weirdness, because that is just what makes people people. Again, it wasn't crippling for me. There are some people who will be a little weird about it. Maybe those people aren't meant to be your friends. Maybe they're just judgy people. So I would rate it at just a moderate level of, you'll have some questions. If you meet decent people, it's not going to be a big deal.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Like with the people that I've made friends with, there was never any issue. It was mostly just like if I was doing it with like a one-off conversation with someone I'd never met, those are usually the people who were more skeptical about it. But it's like, I don't know if those people are already going to be kind of judgy people, because it's not like, I was friends with them. But yeah, like with my friends, they're usually just curious about it.
I like the idea of switching our focus here from what do people think about homeschooling to, well, these are just rude, judgmental people.
Yeah. They're going to find something they don't like.
I'm liking this. So Nate and Shelby, as a homeschool parent, and I've so enjoyed talking to you guys about your experience in the sciences. I feel like we've gotten some really interesting insights about ways in which you can better prepare your students for scientific study when you're homeschooling. I wonder if, as a parent of grown homeschoolers, my kids are a little older than you guys, but not that much older. Could you, each of you, I'm actually going to ask Shelby to go first because she's younger on this one. Can you, and please feel free to be as frank as you want to, looking back, think of one thing that you really wish your parents had done differently in your homeschool experience? And I will say, as a parent, these are the sorts of things that I find really helpful to hear.
I mean, I think maybe I could have been pushed outside of my comfort zone a little bit more. I mean, I think that there's obviously a line with that. Like, you don't want to be putting your kid in the really uncomfortable situations, right?
Sure.
But I think I mostly all like growing up, I pretty much stuck close to my siblings pretty much 24/7 with everything. So maybe pushing me to do more things on my own, or like do more things. So like in terms of, anything outside the house, like doing more social stuff on my own versus being able to kind of rely on my siblings to help me out. So I'd say that's probably the main thing that I could think of, because definitely when I transitioned to college and I moved out, I didn't realize how much I kind of relied on my siblings until I moved out. And then it was a huge adjustment for me.
Yeah. And I think that's such an interesting insight, because again, as a parent, you're so delighted when your kids are all getting along with each other that you're not necessarily going to push them to interact outside their sibling groups. But remembering that they're not always going to have that sibling group with them is really vital.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Nate?
Sure. I'll second a bit of that. Again, getting along with your siblings and leaning on them is an inherently good, wonderful thing. So you do have to strike that balance of, okay, this is not always going to be the case. You need to be able to make friends with new people. And I did. It was a little bit of an adjustment period at first. As far as things to do differently, I would say I think I would have benefited more from so I wasn't a very much of a sports person, and they tried out like a soccer club and things like that. I think I really would have benefited from a structured outdoorsy thing, be it 4-H, be it Eagle Scouts, Boy Scouts, just something where I am learning skills and you make friends. If you go to Boy Scouts or whatever, you make friends. It's built into that. I got to go to some summer camps, and that was great. So I would say more of that, something more consistently, because you only see those kids for a couple weeks out of the year.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think this has been so interesting. Again, like Susan said, just to reiterate that it's cool to see your experiences and the goods and the bads, like you say, Nathan, the pros and the cons. If we could finish out here on a positive note,
Sure.
Could you each, maybe starting with you, Nathan, give us one thing that you are thankful for from your homeschooling experience?
Well, I will be reiterating some of what I said earlier, but I think my homeschooling experience gave me the space to feel free to explore my interests, and not just in a surface level way, but to learn how to really study them. So that combination, I think I had a good combination of elementary and middle school, sort of working at my own pace for a bit and just following up on what I wanted to, within the guidelines of, okay, well-rounded education, you can't not do math just because you don't like math. Combining that in the beginning with, okay, now you have access to a more structured online course system with specialized people. You have someone who does chemistry, and you can ask them chemistry questions, or biology. And I remember I met some great teachers, and I would stay after class and ask them, and they ended up mentoring me a bit and helping me decide what I wanted to do. So I'm rambling a bit, but having that freedom in the beginning, and then once I had found what I really wanted to do, that added support and structure and mentorship, that combination, I think I would be a very different person without that, not in a good way.
Yeah. And what I kind of have to say builds off of that a bit, but having, a teacher, your parent, right, who is doing a more personalized individual education versus it being in like a whole classroom where you're just doing what the classroom is doing, when your teacher can focus specifically on the subjects that interest you and take the time to go through the parts that you're struggling with, I think that's really beneficial. I think it really helped me because the class was going, more at my pace. And I didn't feel like if I was struggling with something, I didn't feel like I was falling behind and wasn't going to catch up. My mom could tailor things and spend extra time to work with me if I was struggling with something. And I think that's something that is really hard to get out of a traditional classroom setting, because they can't change the pace of the class because a couple students are struggling with something. I mean, not necessarily change the pace of the class, but, focusing more on specific topics. Right. So, yeah.
That's a great point. Thanks, Shelby. So with that, we really appreciate you all joining us and sharing your experiences. It sounds like you're both off to doing amazing things this coming year, this coming semester. And I hope that we get reports on how Antarctica goes, because that's just so thrilling.
Yes, I'll have to be sure to send pictures.
Yeah, let us know how that polar plunge goes.
Right. I'm going to freeze. It will be wonderful.
Thank you for listening to the Well-Trained Mind podcast. You can find Susan at facebook.com/susan.wise.bauer and Susanna on Instagram at hopintohomeschool. Our engineering and mixing is done by AJ Falari at ajfalari.online. This podcast is produced by Well-Trained Mind Press, and our supervising producer is Chris Bauer. If you enjoyed the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have questions, responses, or ideas for future episodes, email us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. We'll be back next week, so stay tuned.